My name is Captain Elena Vasquez, Merchant Marine, United Nations World Food Program, or at least I was. The blue helmets don't mean much when there's no headquarters to report to. The cargo manifests are worthless when the ports are empty. The emergency protocols that once governed international food distribution now exist only in my memory and in the laminated cards taped to the bridge console. But I still run the manifest checks every morning at 0600 hours, still calculate tonnage per person using the WHO minimum caloric requirements, still plot efficient distribution routes on charts that mark harbors, which no longer exist. Because some part of the system still matters, even when we're the last ones following it. Even when the world has forgotten that systems once existed to prevent exactly what we're living through now. This is day 137. We've been at sea for nearly 5 months, minus the 2 weeks we spent anchored off Dakar trying to establish a ground distribution network that collapsed when the local military seized our initial food shipment and disappeared inland. We're running on our last reserve fuel tanks, backup generators cycling every 6 hours to preserve what's left of our power grid, and we've been stretching rations that were originally calculated to feed 50,000 people for 2 weeks, according to established WFP emergency protocols. That's what we call it now. Stretching time. Every 50-kilogram sack of rice becomes 4 smaller distributions. Every can of milk powder gets diluted until it barely retains nutritional value. Every high-energy protein bar gets cut into quarters and rationed like precious metal. We've learned to make 2 weeks of food last 2 months, but you can't stretch nutrition indefinitely. The human body keeps its own accounting, and the ledger is starting to show deficits we can't calculate away. The MV Esperanza Mondiale was a converted Panamax container vessel, hull number WFP 847, built in Busan 12 years ago for Samsung Heavy Industries under contract with the United Nations World Food Program. She was 334 meters long, 42 meters wide, and could carry 14,000 TEU containers with a deadweight capacity of 165,000 tons. She'd been retrofitted with specialized climate-controlled holds for emergency food distribution, equipped with redundant refrigeration systems that could maintain grain storage at optimal temperature and humidity for up to 18 months. She had automated loading systems that could unload 200 tons of supplies per hour, water purification systems capable of producing 50,000 liters of clean drinking water daily, and communication arrays that could coordinate with relief operations across 3 continents simultaneously. The whole works. Now half the refrigeration units are offline because we can't afford the fuel to run them. The crane systems operate on manual backup because the automated systems require too much power. The water purification runs at quarter capacity because we're conserving the filter systems that we can no longer replace. And our cargo capacity that once moved enough grain to feed Bangladesh for a month now carries what might be the last known stockpile of emergency rations in the Atlantic basin, distributed so carefully that every decision about a single meal could determine whether someone lives or dies tomorrow.
When the Cascade failure hit, we were 3 days out of Rotterdam, scheduled for emergency deployment to Madagascar, where successive waves of desert locusts had devastated the rice paddies that fed 18 million people. The plan was surgical, efficient, proven. Establish a regional distribution hub using the port facilities at Toamasina. Coordinate with local officials who had experience managing food crises. Implement standard WFP protocols for mass feeding operations that had been refined through decades of humanitarian work. We had detailed operational plans that covered everything from initial assessment through final transition to local management. Supply chain logistics that could move 200 tons of food daily, medical protocols for treating malnutrition that could save thousands of lives in the first week alone. That plan died the same morning when agricultural futures markets went into free fall and never recovered, when grain prices increased by 400% in 18 hours, when the global food distribution network that had prevented famine for 60 years collapsed in less than a week. Global crop yields had been declining for 3 years before the final collapse. Climate change had shifted growing seasons by weeks in some regions, turned fertile farmland into desert in others, and made weather patterns so unpredictable that farmers couldn't plan crop rotations more than one season ahead. But the collapse itself was biological. A new strain of wheat rust fungus emerged from experimental agricultural trials in Kazakhstan, resistant to all known treatments, spreading faster than any plant disease in recorded history. Within 6 months, it had crossed 4 continents and infected wheat crops from Argentina to Australia. Then came the bacterial blight that targeted soybeans, the viral infection that destroyed corn harvests across North America, and the parasitic infestation that killed rice crops throughout Southeast Asia. Each crisis amplified the others. Failed crops meant increased pressure on remaining agricultural land. Desperate farmers used more pesticides, which created resistant pest populations. Monoculture farming designed for efficiency couldn't adapt to rapidly changing conditions. The global food system had been optimized for stability and efficiency, not for survival. I still remember the final WHO briefing before communications went dark. Dr. Sarah Chen, the organization's lead epidemiologist, reading statistics in the same calm voice she'd used to brief us on cholera outbreaks and refugee malnutrition. Wheat rust fungus has achieved complete resistance to all known treatments and has been confirmed in grain shipments on every continent. Soybean bacterial blight has crossed 3 continental barriers and is present in 67% of global production areas. Rice paddies in Southeast Asia are testing positive for type 7 bacterial wilt, which has no known treatment and an 89% crop mortality rate. Current projections indicate global grain production will decline by 78% within 18 months. Protein production from livestock will decline by 65% as feedstocks are depleted. We estimate that current global food reserves, if distributed efficiently, could maintain minimal subsistence nutrition for approximately 40% of the world's population for 8 months. Then static. That same static that means there's no one left to broadcast to, no one left to coordinate the response. No one left to implement the emergency protocols that were supposed to prevent exactly this scenario.
Captain Morrison kept the ship on schedule for 6 days after we lost contact with WFP headquarters, waiting for updated coordinates that never came. He followed protocol page by page while the world starved in real time. Emergency frequencies filled with calls from cargo ships reporting empty ports where harbor masters had abandoned their posts to search for food for their own families. Grain terminals in major ports stood empty because the automated loading systems had failed and there was no one left with the technical knowledge to repair them. International shipping routes that had carried food across oceans for generations were abandoned as fuel became too valuable to burn on uncertain journeys to ports that might not exist when you arrived. We listened to it all on the emergency frequencies. Cargo captains reporting that the port of Hamburg was burning, that the grain silos had been ransacked by crowds of starving people who couldn't understand that raw wheat wouldn't keep them alive. Commercial fishing fleets abandoning their catches because there were no buyers, no processing facilities, no fuel for their ships. Container vessels drifting powerless in international waters because their crews had jumped ship at the last port, hoping to reach their families before the food ran out completely. By week 2, with no communication from headquarters and emergency calls coming from every direction, Morrison gave the final order that changed everything. No more scheduled ports.
No more predetermined routes. No more adherence to shipping protocols that assumed a functioning world. We would cruise established shipping lanes, respond to emergency calls when we could reach them safely, and distribute what we could to whoever we found. The Esperanza Mondiale became a floating food bank with no bank to answer to, carrying cargo that could keep 50,000 people alive for 2 weeks, or 5,000 people alive for 20 weeks, or 500 people alive for 200 weeks. Every distribution decision became a calculation about who lived and who died, about whether to save more people for less time or fewer people for longer. There were 34 crew aboard when we left Rotterdam, men and women from 12 different countries who had signed on for a standard humanitarian mission that was supposed to last 6 weeks. Chief Engineer Santos from the Philippines, who had spent 15 years maintaining systems for cargo operations across the Pacific. Navigation Officer Petrov from Ukraine, whose grandfather had been a wheat farmer and who understood crop cycles better than most agricultural specialists. Communications Officer Chen from Singapore, who spoke 6 languages and could coordinate with port authorities anywhere in the world. Medical Officer Kim from South Korea, who had treated malnutrition in refugee camps and knew how to stretch medical supplies when there were no resupplies coming. 27 are still alive. 19 of them fit for duty. The rest are either managing specialized systems like the grain storage climate controls, maintaining the hydroponic gardens we've established in empty containers, or too sick from malnutrition to work full shifts. Chief Engineer Santos has lost 30 pounds and needs to rest for 10 minutes between equipment checks, but he still knows how to maintain engine systems that keep us moving. Medical Officer Kim has been rationing her own insulin for 3 months, testing her blood sugar with strips we found in an abandoned pharmacy in Casablanca, but she still treats crew injuries and monitors everyone's nutrition status.
We run an emergency supply vessel with a skeleton crew that includes our 16-year-old communications apprentice who learned Morse code because our automated systems had started failing, a retired harbor pilot who volunteered when his pension fund collapsed and who navigates by celestial calculations when our GPS system glitches, and our medical officer who's dying slowly from the same resource shortages that are killing the rest of the world. I wasn't supposed to be in command. I was Chief Logistics Officer, responsible for cargo management and distribution planning. My job was calculating optimal load distribution, managing inventory systems, and coordinating with ground teams who would handle actual food distribution. Morrison was the backbone, steady, diplomatic, by the book, but pragmatic when situations required flexibility. He'd commanded supply ships for the WFP for 8 years, managed emergency distributions during floods in Bangladesh, earthquakes in Nepal, conflicts in Syria. He understood how to balance humanitarian imperatives with practical constraints, how to negotiate with port authorities who were demanding bribes for docking rights, how to maintain crew morale during missions that stretched longer than planned. I never expected him to break. But 4 months in, after the Marseille incident, when we were forced to choose between feeding 2 competing refugee camps with 1 shipment, both groups desperate, both having suffered casualties from starvation, both presenting us with children who hadn't eaten in days, Morrison started spending hours in his quarters calculating distribution scenarios that could somehow save everyone. He covered every wall with handwritten equations, trying to find a mathematical solution to impossible moral choices. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating regular meals, spent days working on logistics problems that had no solutions because there simply wasn't enough food in the world anymore to feed everyone who needed it. The final breakdown came when we received emergency calls from 7 different locations in a single day. Refugee camps, abandoned ports, coastal towns where the local governments had collapsed and people were dying in the streets. Morrison spent 18 hours trying to plot a route that could reach all 7 locations, calculating fuel consumption and distribution schedules and transit times, covering his desk with charts and graphs and spreadsheets. When I found him, he was still working, but the numbers didn't make sense anymore. He'd been trying to solve for variables that couldn't be solved, optimizing for outcomes that weren't mathematically possible.
He'd locked himself in his quarters with a bottle of emergency medical alcohol and never came out. I was the one who had to break down that door with Chief Santos's help. I still see it sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. The empty insulin vials on his desk that he'd been using to measure tiny portions of alcohol, the handwritten distribution calculations covering every wall in increasingly erratic handwriting, logistics equations that started logically and devolved into desperate scribblings about finding food that didn't exist for people who were already dead. A note was pinned to the final cargo manifest, written in his careful capital letters, "There's never enough. There will never be enough. The math doesn't work. The math will never work. Someone needs to choose who lives. I can't choose anymore."
I never shared the note with anyone. After Morrison, I didn't move into the captain's cabin. I couldn't handle sleeping in the bed where he'd made his final calculations, surrounded by the charts and manifests he'd been obsessing over. I still sleep in the logistics quarters, in the narrow bunk where I'd spent months learning to manage cargo that was never sufficient for the task we'd been given. But everyone looks to me now. I approve the distribution lists that determine who eats and who doesn't. I authorize fuel consumption that determines how far we can travel and how many emergency calls we can answer. I decide which emergency calls we respond to and which ones we have to ignore because we can't afford the fuel to reach them or because we don't have enough food left to make the journey worthwhile. I hate every decision, but I make them because we're still floating, because someone has to make them, because the alternative is drifting powerlessly while people starve waiting for help that will never come. We've made it 137 days by avoiding predictable patterns that could make us targets. We stay mobile, changing course every few days, never remaining in one area long enough for hostile groups to organize intercept operations. At night, we drift with minimal lighting, just enough illumination for essential navigation, engines at quarter power to reduce our acoustic signature, AIS transponder broadcasting our identity as a UN food aid vessel to legitimate authorities while making us visible to those who genuinely need help. It's a delicate balance. We need to be found by people who need food, but not by people who would take our food by force and leave us with nothing to distribute. During daylight hours, we monitor emergency frequencies constantly. Communications Officer Chen has rigged a scanning system that cycles through maritime emergency channels, amateur radio frequencies, and what's left of the international distress networks. Most of what we hear is static now. Automated distress beacons from ships whose crews abandoned them months ago, weather stations broadcasting storm warnings to empty seas, emergency broadcasts in languages Chen doesn't recognize from locations that don't appear on any current charts, requesting assistance for situations we can't even understand. But sometimes we hear voices, real people broadcasting from real locations, dealing with real crises that we might be able to help address. A coastal village in Senegal where fishing boats can't get fuel to reach traditional fishing grounds and the local population is surviving on seaweed and whatever they can scavenge from abandoned stores. A refugee camp in Morocco where 800 people are sharing food intended for 200, where children are dying from malnutrition while medical supplies sit in warehouses because there's no fuel for the trucks that would distribute them. An agricultural cooperative in the Canary Islands that has seeds and land and water, but no technical knowledge about how to adapt traditional farming techniques to the climate conditions that have made conventional agriculture impossible. Don't misunderstand. There are still governments out there, still port authorities, still coast guards patrolling territorial waters, but not all of them are interested in international law anymore. Not all of them distinguish between legitimate humanitarian operations and potential targets for resource acquisition. When your population is starving, when your infrastructure has collapsed,
When your agricultural system has failed completely, a ship carrying 5,000 tons of grain starts looking like a military asset that could determine the survival of your entire region. We learned that lesson in Casablanca 3 weeks into our mission. We'd responded to an official request from the Moroccan government for emergency food aid. The message had come through official channels, using proper diplomatic protocols, requesting specific types of assistance that aligned perfectly with our cargo capacity. We docked at the commercial port following standard WFP procedures, began unloading operations according to established protocols that had been used successfully in dozens of previous emergencies. What we didn't know until it was too late was that the Moroccan government was actually a coalition of military officers who had seized control of port infrastructure when the central government collapsed. They had the right uniforms, the right paperwork, the right official seals on their documents. But they weren't interested in distributing food to the population according to humanitarian principles. They were interested in controlling food supplies to maintain power over the regions they could still govern.
They took 200 tons of grain at gunpoint, not through violence, but through the implied threat of violence backed by official authority that we couldn't verify or challenge. They provided us with signed receipts and official documentation, but they also made it clear that we could leave peacefully with most of our cargo intact, or we could resist and lose everything, including our ship and our crew. They left us with fuel bills we couldn't pay because the port authorities were demanding payment in grain rather than currency, which had become worthless for international transactions. 3 crew members were detained for customs violations that didn't exist in any legal framework we recognized, immigration issues with their documentation, problems with cargo manifests that had been perfectly acceptable when we docked, bureaucratic complications that would require extended negotiations to resolve. Ramirez, our assistant logistics coordinator, tried to stop them from taking the milk powder that had been specifically designated for infant feeding programs. They didn't shoot him. They didn't even arrest him officially. They just wouldn't let him back aboard when we were forced to leave port, claiming his paperwork wasn't in order and that he'd need to remain in Morocco until the documentation issues could be resolved. We left him there because the alternative was losing our entire cargo and our ability to help anyone. Ramirez understood. He'd been managing humanitarian logistics for 6 years. He knew the calculus. Better to lose one person and continue the mission than to lose everything trying to save that one person. When we pulled away from the dock, he was standing on the pier with his duffel bag, giving us a thumbs up to indicate he understood why we were leaving him behind. We never heard from him again. Other ports have been different. We anchored off Las Palmas 3 weeks later and found something that shouldn't have been possible: order. The Canary Islands had somehow maintained agricultural production through greenhouse hydroponics powered by geothermal energy, aquaculture systems that were producing more fish than the local population could consume, and wind farms that were still generating enough electricity to power desalination plants and food processing facilities. Their local government was still functioning, still paying unemployment benefits to displaced workers, still maintaining public transportation systems and hospital services. They didn't need our food supplies. Their agricultural systems were not only maintaining the local population, but actually producing surplus crops that they were preserving for long-term storage. They had figured out how to adapt to the new climate conditions, how to grow food using techniques that didn't depend on large-scale agriculture or global supply chains. Instead of requesting aid, they offered to trade with us. Fresh vegetables grown in their hydroponic facilities, medical supplies manufactured in local pharmaceutical operations that were still running, and 200 liters of biodiesel refined from algae using solar-powered processing systems. The trade was valuable, but what was more valuable was the knowledge transfer. Their agricultural specialists spent 2 days teaching our crew about hydroponic growing techniques that could be implemented in ship containers, about algae cultivation systems that could provide both food and fuel, about water purification methods that use significantly less energy than our current systems.
They shared technical manuals and equipment specifications, communication frequencies for other communities that were implementing similar sustainability programs, and most importantly, evidence that recovery was possible.
But we couldn't stay. Our mission extended beyond any single location, and there were emergency calls coming from communities that weren't as fortunate as Las Palmas. As we prepared to leave, Dr. Maria Santos, the coordinator of their agricultural recovery project, handed me a sealed package containing seeds for drought-resistant vegetables, technical documentation for solar-powered growing systems, and a list of contacts for other communities that were working on similar projects. She said, "You're not just carrying food anymore. You're carrying hope. These communities need to know that someone figured out how to survive, that recovery is possible." That same week, we intercepted emergency calls from a cargo vessel, the Ivory Express, stranded off the coast of Senegal. The calls had been broadcasting for 3 days, growing weaker each time as their battery power failed. Captain Amara Diallo, broadcasting in increasingly desperate tones, reported that her ship was carrying the last harvest from Mali's experimental drought-resistant sorghum program. 18,000 tons of grain that represented 2 years of agricultural research and the only successful crop that had been produced in the region since the climate failures began. Pirates had attacked their escort vessels during the transit from Bamako to Dakar. Not traditional maritime pirates interested in cargo they could sell, but organized military groups that understood the strategic value of controlling food supplies. They'd sunk the escort ships and disabled the Ivory Express's engines, but they hadn't boarded immediately. Instead, they were waiting for the crew to surrender voluntarily, broadcasting surrender demands and offering safe passage to crew members who would cooperate with cargo transfer operations. Captain Diallo's broadcasts were a countdown to catastrophe. Day 1. Pirates have disabled our engines and are demanding surrender. We're maintaining defensive positions, but we don't have weapons capable of fighting them off. Day 2. They're not trying to board, they're just waiting. I think they want us to run out of food and water, so we'll surrender without resistance. Day 3. My crew is talking about surrender. I understand why, but this grain could feed 50,000 people for months. If we lose it, those people die. We change course to investigate, pushing our engines harder than we'd run them in weeks, burning fuel we couldn't afford to lose on a rescue mission that might already be too late. When we reached the coordinates Captain Diallo had provided, we found the Ivory Express drifting, with its engine compartment flooded, bridge windows shattered from small arms fire, and cargo holds standing open like wounds. 18,000 tons of grain scattered across the ocean, floating in massive slicks that stretched for kilometers. Some of it was still intact in waterproof containers, but most of it was ruined, dissolved into the ocean or contaminated with salt water.
Captain Diallo and her crew were gone. We never found bodies, never found lifeboats, never found any evidence of what had happened during the final confrontation. The ship's log ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence. 3rd day. Pirates are broadcasting surrender demands every hour. Crew morale declining. I've made the decision to... That was it. No more entries. Pirates in this new world don't just steal cargo. They steal the people who know how to operate complex systems. Experienced ship crews are more valuable than the cargo they're carrying because ships are useless without people who understand navigation, engine maintenance, cargo handling, and maritime operations. We found evidence that the pirates were operating a network of hijacked vessels using captured crews to operate ships they couldn't manage themselves, running supply lines that connected black market ports across West Africa. The loss of the Ivory Express and its cargo wasn't just an economic disaster, it was an educational one. The agricultural research that had produced those drought-resistant crop varieties was lost along with the grain. The farmers who had learned to cultivate those crops were scattered or dead. The infrastructure that had supported the experimental agricultural program was abandoned. 2 years of progress toward agricultural adaptation was erased in a single pirate attack. The sea itself is changing in ways that traditional maritime navigation never had to account for. Climate change didn't just affect land-based agriculture, it transformed ocean ecosystems, altered current patterns, and made weather prediction nearly impossible without satellite data that we no longer have access to. Fish populations have collapsed not just from overfishing, but from ocean acidification that has disrupted food chains from the microscopic level up through commercial species that once supported entire coastal economies. Industrial fishing fleets abandoned their operations when fuel became too expensive to justify catching fish that had no buyers, when processing facilities shut down because there were no workers or electricity to run them, when international markets for seafood collapsed along with everything else. The massive factory ships that once harvested thousands of tons of fish daily now drift as ghost ships, their automated systems still operating, but with no crews to manage them, no ports to deliver their catches to, no fuel to return to home bases that may no longer exist. But nature doesn't recover quickly from a century of industrial exploitation. The ocean is emptier now than it was even during the height of overfishing. We haven't seen dolphin pods in 6 weeks. We haven't seen commercial fishing boats in 2 months. The seabird populations that once followed fishing vessels to feed on bycatch have disappeared almost entirely. Sometimes we pass floating aquaculture farms, massive cage systems where millions of farmed salmon died when automated feeding systems failed and maintenance crews abandoned their posts to search for food for their own families. The dead fish created massive algae blooms that consumed oxygen and killed everything else in the surrounding water. We've sailed through ocean areas that stretch for hundreds of kilometers, where the water is brown with decomposition, where the smell of death carries for nautical miles, where nothing lives except the bacteria that feed on decay. These dead zones are expanding. Every week, we encounter new areas where the ocean has become sterile, where our fish-finding sonar detects nothing but empty water and sinking organic matter. Navigation has become increasingly difficult as we lose access to satellite systems and automated weather reporting. GPS satellites are still operational, but their ground control systems have failed, so position accuracy degrades every month. Weather prediction relies on automated buoy systems that haven't been maintained in months, shore-based radar installations that have lost power, and meteorological satellites that are beginning to fail without ground support. Chief Navigator Petrov has reverted to celestial navigation techniques that haven't been used regularly in commercial shipping for decades. He takes star sights with a sextant every morning and evening, calculates our position using nautical almanacs and mathematical tables, plots our course on paper charts that show ocean depths and current patterns, but can't account for how those patterns have changed as climate systems reorganize themselves around new temperature and wind patterns.
Storms form faster and more unpredictably than traditional weather patterns would suggest. We've encountered 3 major weather systems that appeared with less than 6 hours warning, generating wave heights and wind speeds that exceeded anything in our meteorological databases. The Esperanza Mondiale was designed to handle rough weather, but she's operating with reduced power systems, degraded hull integrity from months of continuous operation without proper maintenance, and a crew that's physically weakened from malnutrition and constant stress. 2 weeks ago, we encountered a storm system that taught us how much the ocean has changed. The weather began normally, moderate winds from the southeast, gradually increasing cloud cover, the kind of conditions that traditional forecasting would predict would develop into a typical Atlantic storm over 12 to 18 hours. Instead, the system intensified in 4 hours from moderate winds to hurricane-force conditions with wave heights exceeding 8 meters. We lost main engine power when water flooded the air intake systems. Emergency generators kept essential systems running, but we couldn't maintain steerage way in the heavy seas. For 6 hours, the Esperanza Mondiale was disabled, drifting powerless while waves broke over the bow and flooded container storage areas. The refrigeration systems for our food storage failed when saltwater shorted electrical connections. We lost approximately 400 tons of grain to water damage, food that could have fed 2,000 people for months. Chief Engineer Santos worked 18 hours straight in flooded engine compartments, sometimes underwater for minutes at a time, to restore main engine power.
Medical Officer Kim treated 3 cases of near drowning when crew members were swept overboard during damage control operations. Communications Officer Chen rigged emergency communication systems using battery power when our main electrical systems failed. We survived, but the storm taught us that the ocean has become as dangerous and unpredictable as everything else in this changed world. Our cargo holds tell the story of a global supply chain that's completely broken down. Container 847 Alpha holds 50 tons of rice from India that's already 8 months past optimal distribution date, grain that was harvested during the final functioning season before the monsoon pattern shifted and destroyed the agricultural regions that had fed 1 billion people. The rice is still edible, still nutritionally adequate, but its quality degrades every week. In 6 months, it will be suitable only for emergency subsistence. In 12 months, it will be useless. Container 623 Bravo contains Ukrainian wheat that was harvested just before the eastern agricultural zones were abandoned to massive refugee migration. 15 million people fled westward when the wheat rust fungus destroyed 90% of the crop, and the government acknowledged that the region could no longer support its population. The wheat we're carrying might be the last grain that will ever be exported from Ukraine. The infrastructure that supported wheat production, the farms, the storage facilities, the transportation networks, the technical expertise, has been scattered or destroyed. Even if the fungal infections could be controlled, it would take decades to rebuild the systems that once made Ukraine a major grain exporter.
Container 199 Charlie is packed with freeze-dried protein supplements manufactured in a facility in Denmark that was part of the European Union's Emergency Food Reserve System. The facility had been producing high-density nutrition supplements for disaster relief operations around the world. When the EU's agricultural systems began failing, they redirected all production toward domestic emergency feeding programs. The protein supplements in our hold represent the final production run before the facility was converted to produce basic subsistence rations for European populations that could no longer be fed through normal agricultural systems. Every morning, I walk through the hold with Chief Engineer Santos and Medical Officer Kim, conducting inspections that have become increasingly desperate. We monitor temperature and humidity controls that are failing as our power systems degrade. We calculate remaining freshness windows for food that was never intended to be stored this long under these conditions. We identify containers where spoilage has begun and make decisions about whether the food is still safe for human consumption or whether it needs to be disposed of to prevent contamination of other supplies. Santos points out which refrigeration units are operating outside normal parameters, which ones are consuming too much power, which ones are likely to fail completely in the next few weeks. Kim explains the nutritional science behind food degradation, how vitamin content decreases over time, how protein structures break down, how contamination risks increase as preservation systems fail. I do the mathematics of survival, calculating how many people we can still feed, for how long, under what distribution scenarios. The numbers get smaller every day. Not just because we're distributing food to people who need it, but because the food itself is dying. Spoilage, contamination, system failures, and simple time are consuming our cargo as surely as if we were distributing it. We're not just racing against human need, we're racing against entropy itself.
The political landscape has fragmented in ways that make traditional humanitarian operations nearly impossible. Nation-states still exist on paper, but their ability to control territory, maintain infrastructure, or provide services to their populations has collapsed in most regions. Instead of dealing with established governments through diplomatic channels, we encounter a patchwork of local authorities, military commanders, civilian committees, and armed groups, each controlling small territories and competing for resources. Port authorities that once followed international maritime law now operate according to local survival needs. Harbor masters demand payment in food rather than currency, which has become worthless for international transactions. Customs officials who once processed cargo according to established procedures now seize whatever they think their communities need to survive. Immigration controls that once managed crew documentation now serve as pretexts for detaining skilled personnel who might be useful for local operations. 3 weeks ago, we approached the port of Freetown in Sierra Leone following a request for emergency food aid from what claimed to be the provisional government. The request had come through amateur radio channels rather than official diplomatic communications, but it included detailed information about population sizes, nutritional needs, and distribution capabilities that suggested legitimate humanitarian planning. When we arrived, we found that provisional government meant a coalition of former military officers, local chiefs, and civilian administrators who had organized to maintain order after the central government lost the ability to control territory outside the capital city. They controlled the port, several surrounding districts, and approximately 150,000 people who were surviving on subsistence agriculture and whatever resources they could obtain through trade or aid. Their leader, Colonel James Camara, had been a logistics officer in the Sierra Leone Armed Forces before the government collapsed. He understood humanitarian operations, spoke fluent English, and presented detailed plans for food distribution that followed international best practices. But he also made it clear that his authority derived from his ability to provide security and resources to the people under his protection, not from any legal mandate or democratic process. The negotiation was unlike any humanitarian operation I'd experienced. Instead of working with established procedures and legal frameworks, we were essentially conducting international relations with a local warlord who happened to have humanitarian training and good intentions. Colonel Camara needed food to maintain legitimacy with his population. We needed security guarantees and fuel to continue our mission. The transaction was more like arms negotiations than humanitarian aid distribution. We agreed to provide 300 tons of grain in exchange for 500 liters of diesel fuel, security escorts for our shore parties, and guaranteed safe passage out of territorial waters. But the negotiation also included discussions about information exchange, communication frequencies, and future cooperation agreements. Colonel Camara's organization was part of an informal network of local authorities who were trying to maintain stability and coordinate resources across West Africa without any central government support.
The food distribution itself was a model of efficiency and humanitarian principles. Colonel Camara's people had established feeding centers, medical stations, and population registration systems that ensured food reached the people who needed it most. Children, pregnant women, and elderly people received priority allocations. Distribution was supervised by local women's organizations that prevented corruption and ensured fair access. Medical teams monitored recipients for signs of malnutrition and provided basic healthcare services alongside food aid. But the entire operation existed outside any legal framework that the international community would recognize. There were no treaties, no diplomatic agreements, no international oversight, no accountability mechanisms. We were conducting humanitarian operations with a local authority that had no legal standing, using procedures that had no official recognition, in a territory that might be controlled by different people next month. The success of the Freetown operation led to similar arrangements with other local authorities along the West African coast. A fishing cooperative in Guinea-Bissau that had organized coastal communities into a mutual aid network, a former university professor in Mauritania who had established agricultural communes using scientific farming techniques, a religious leader in Gambia who had organized refugee settlements and maintained order through traditional authority structures rather than government institutions. Each negotiation was different. Each local authority had different capabilities and needs, but the pattern was consistent. Formal government structures had collapsed, but informal networks of local leadership were emerging to fill the gap. These new authorities understood that their legitimacy depended on their ability to provide security and resources to their populations.
They were willing to work with humanitarian organizations, but only on terms that served their survival needs. The challenge for humanitarian operations was adapting to political realities that didn't exist in any training manual or operational procedure. The World Food Program had detailed protocols for working with governments, with international organizations, with established relief agencies. But none of those protocols covered negotiations with local military commanders who controlled ports through force of arms, or with traditional chiefs who had resumed authority when modern governments failed, or with civilian committees that had organized spontaneously to manage resource distribution in abandoned territories.
We learned to evaluate local authorities based on their practical capabilities rather than their legal standing. Could they guarantee security for our operations? Did they have distribution networks that could reach the people who needed food? Were they committed to humanitarian principles of non-discrimination and need-based allocation? Could they provide resources that we needed to continue our mission? These evaluations required intelligence gathering that went beyond traditional humanitarian assessment. We monitored radio communications to understand power dynamics and territorial control. We observed port operations to assess technical capabilities and security procedures. We interviewed crew members from other ships to learn about their experiences with local authorities. We developed informal networks of information sharing with other humanitarian organizations that were operating in the same regions.
The result was a form of humanitarian diplomacy that operated parallel to whatever remained of formal diplomatic channels. We maintained detailed records of our agreements with local authorities, not because they had legal standing, but because they served as the foundation for ongoing relationships that could support continued humanitarian operations. We honored our commitments even when local conditions changed, because reputation and reliability were our primary assets in negotiations where we had no legal recourse or enforcement mechanisms. The political fragmentation also created opportunities that wouldn't have existed under normal governmental structures. In the Canary Islands, we discovered that the absence of central bureaucracy had actually accelerated agricultural innovation. Local engineers and farmers were implementing experimental growing techniques that would have taken years to approve through normal regulatory processes. They developed hydroponic systems using solar power and seawater desalination, created closed-loop aquaculture that produced both fish and fertilizer, and established seed banks that preserved genetic diversity from crops that were no longer viable in their original growing regions. The breakdown of international trade barriers meant that communities could adapt rapidly to local conditions without waiting for global supply chains to respond. A fishing village in Cape Verde had converted abandoned tourist hotels into vertical farming facilities, growing vegetables in climate-controlled environments that used a fraction of the water required by traditional agriculture. A former mining town in Morocco had repurposed industrial equipment to create large-scale composting operations that turned organic waste into soil supplements that could support agriculture in degraded land. These innovations were happening in isolation, without coordination or knowledge sharing between communities that were solving similar problems. Our role began to evolve from emergency food distribution to information transfer. We started carrying technical manuals and equipment specifications along with food supplies. We documented successful adaptation strategies and shared them with other communities facing similar challenges. We became a floating library of survival techniques, carrying not just calories, but knowledge about how to produce calories in a world where traditional agriculture had failed.
4 days ago, everything changed in a way that transformed our understanding of what we were actually carrying and what our mission could become. We were running a standard patrol pattern along the West African shipping corridor, monitoring emergency frequencies and plotting course adjustments based on fuel consumption calculations, when Communications Officer Chen picked up an automated distress signal that was unlike anything we'd encountered before. Not voice communication, not Morse code, but digital data transmission on a frequency reserved for scientific research operations.
The signal repeated every 6 hours with metadata that made my hands shake when I understood what I was reading. UN Facility Alpha 7. Seed vault integrity compromised. Genetic samples require immediate evacuation. Priority level, species continuation. Requesting assistance from any vessel with climate-controlled cargo capacity. I'd heard references to Alpha 7 during advanced WFP training sessions that covered long-term food security planning. It was a floating research station operated jointly by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and the Global Crop Diversity Trust, designed as a mobile backup to terrestrial seed banks that were vulnerable to power grid failures, political instability, and climate disasters. When the Southbard Global Seed Vault began experiencing permafrost melting that threatened its storage systems, Alpha 7 had been deployed to preserve genetic samples of crop varieties while researching new drought-resistant, disease-resistant strains that might survive in post-collapse conditions. The facility was essentially a floating laboratory equipped with cryogenic storage systems, genetic analysis equipment, and experimental growing facilities. It carried genetic samples from thousands of crop varieties, heritage seeds from traditional farming communities, experimental strains developed by agricultural research institutions, wild plant genetics that might contain traits useful for developing climate-adapted crops. More importantly, it carried the scientists and technical knowledge needed to use those genetic resources to develop new agricultural systems. The signal was broadcasting from coordinates near the Cape Verde Islands, 340 nautical miles southwest of our current position. According to our fuel calculations, we had enough diesel to reach the coordinates, but the journey would consume our entire reserve supply. If Alpha 7 was real, if their research was intact, if they had viable genetic samples and the scientific expertise to use them, we might be carrying the foundation for humanity's agricultural recovery. But if the signal was compromised, if the facility had been abandoned or captured, if we were walking into another trap like we'd encountered in Casablanca, we would lose our ship, our remaining food supplies, and any chance of completing our humanitarian mission.
Chief Engineer Santos ran fuel consumption calculations 3 times using different engine settings and weather scenarios. Under optimal conditions, we could reach Alpha 7, conduct brief operations, and return to our current patrol area with approximately 12 hours of fuel remaining. Under adverse conditions, bad weather, equipment failures, extended operations, we would run out of fuel before reaching any port where we could resupply. The decision wasn't just about whether to investigate a distress signal. It was about whether to risk everything on the possibility that Alpha 7 represented a solution to the global food crisis rather than just another humanitarian emergency. I called a crew meeting in the mess hall at 2,000 hours after the evening meal distribution and before the night watch rotation. 19 people gathered around the table where we'd been making life and death decisions for 137 days. I laid out the signal data, the fuel calculations, and the potential implications. We weren't just deciding whether to respond to a distress call, we were deciding whether to risk our mission and our lives on the possibility that we could carry genetic resources that might allow humanity to feed itself again. Navigation Officer Petrov spoke first. His family had been wheat farmers in Ukraine for 4 generations before collectivization, then independent farmers after the Soviet collapse, then refugees when the agricultural system failed completely. He understood genetics, understood crop development, understood that agriculture was fundamentally about preserving and improving plant varieties across generations. My grandfather saved seeds every harvest, he said, not just to plant next year, but to improve the varieties, to adapt them to changing conditions. If Alpha 7 has those genetics, if they've been working on adaptation for climate change and disease resistance, then this isn't just about saving people today, it's about whether people can eat tomorrow. Medical Officer Kim approached the question from a different perspective. She'd been monitoring the crew's health status, tracking the gradual deterioration in physical condition as our nutrition situation worsened. Every day we delayed reaching a port with medical facilities increased the probability of losing crew members to preventable diseases, to complications from malnutrition, to medical emergencies we couldn't treat with our remaining supplies.
But she also understood that medical care was meaningless if there was no long-term solution to the food crisis. We can keep people alive for months with medical intervention, she said, but if there's no food system to support them, we're just prolonging suffering. If Alpha 7 has solutions, if they have genetic resources that could restart agriculture, then the risk might be justified. Communications Officer Chen had been monitoring radio traffic from across the Atlantic basin. He had heard distress calls from communities that were surviving on subsistence agriculture, emergency broadcasts from research stations that were still operating, and fragments of communication from other humanitarian organizations that were trying to coordinate response efforts. There are still people working on solutions, he said. Agricultural research stations, university programs, community organizations. But they're isolated. They don't have access to genetic resources, they don't have scientific equipment, they don't have the knowledge base that Alpha 7 might have. If we can connect those resources, if we can distribute genetics and knowledge along with food, we might be able to support recovery efforts instead of just managing decline.
The discussion continued for 2 hours. Every crew member participated, not because this was a democratic process, but because everyone understood that the decision would affect their survival and the survival of everyone we might encounter in the future. Chief Engineer Santos explained the technical risks of pushing our fuel systems beyond design parameters. Assistant Navigation Officer Williams, barely 18 years old, talked about the communities she'd seen during shore operations. People who are trying to grow food using traditional techniques that weren't working in the new climate conditions. Senior Logistics Coordinator Rodriguez described the degradation of our food supplies, the reality that we were racing against spoilage and contamination as much as against human need. No one argued against investigating Alpha 7. The risks were obvious, but the potential benefits were compelling enough to justify those risks. If Alpha 7 had genetic resources and scientific knowledge that could support agricultural recovery, then our mission would change from emergency relief to long-term reconstruction. Instead of just distributing food until our supplies ran out, we could distribute the tools and knowledge that communities needed to feed themselves. We altered course at 0500 hours, pushing our engines to maximum sustainable power for the first time in weeks. The Esperanza Mondiale responded sluggishly, her hull fouled with marine growth that reduced efficiency, her engines operating with reduced power because we couldn't afford to run all systems simultaneously. But she moved steadily southwest, cutting through swells that seemed calmer than they'd been in months, under skies that were clear enough for celestial navigation if our GPS systems failed. The approach to Cape Verde required careful navigation through waters that had become a graveyard for abandoned vessels. We passed the drifting hulks of container ships whose crews had abandoned them when fuel ran out, fishing vessels that had lost power and been carried by currents far from their home ports. Even a cruise ship that had been converted to a refugee transport before being abandoned when it became impossible to find ports willing to accept the displaced people it carried. Navigation Officer Petrov plotted our course using paper charts and celestial observations, avoiding shipping lanes where disabled vessels were most likely to be drifting. We passed close enough to several abandoned ships to see evidence of hasty evacuations, lifeboats missing from their davits, personal belongings scattered on decks, emergency signals still broadcasting automated distress calls to empty seas. Each abandoned vessel represented dozens or hundreds of people who had been forced to choose between staying with their ship and risking starvation, or abandoning their vessel and hoping to reach land before their emergency supplies ran out. At 1400 hours on the second day, we established visual contact with Alpha 7. The facility was unlike anything I had expected from the technical briefings I had received during WFP training. Instead of a purpose-built research vessel, Alpha 7 appeared to be a converted oil platform anchor system that had been extensively modified with laboratory modules, greenhouse compartments, and living quarters. The structure arose 30 meters above the waterline, supported by massive steel columns that descended deep enough to provide stability in heavy seas. Solar panels covered every horizontal surface, oriented to track the sun's movement across the sky. Wind turbines spun continuously in the Atlantic breeze, generating power for systems that operated around the clock. Aeroponic growing systems lined the exterior walkways, suspended gardens where plants grew with their roots in nutrient mist rather than soil, producing food using a fraction of the water required by traditional agriculture. The entire facility looked like something between a research station and a floating city, designed for long-term self-sufficiency rather than temporary deployment. But Alpha 7 also showed signs of serious damage and system failures. One corner of the platform listed heavily to starboard, suggesting structural damage or flooding in the support columns. Several of the laboratory modules had been sealed with emergency patches, steel plates welded over damaged sections, temporary barriers that blocked access to entire sections of the facility. Smoke rose from what appeared to be emergency heating systems, suggesting that normal power distribution had failed in parts of the complex. We approached slowly, monitoring radio frequencies for communication from the facility, watching for signs of organized activity or security responses. The platform showed clear evidence of continued human occupation, people moving along the walkways, controlled burn operations for waste disposal, signal lights blinking in organized patterns that suggested active communication systems. But the overall impression was of a facility under siege, struggling to maintain operations despite significant damage and resource constraints. Dr. Sarah Okafor met us at the docking platform as we maneuvered the Esperanza Mondiale alongside Alpha 7's mooring systems. She had been the lead agricultural geneticist for the FAO before the global collapse, responsible for preserving crop diversity in emergency situations and developing rapid response protocols for agricultural disasters. When I stepped aboard Alpha 7, she didn't waste time with diplomatic pleasantries or formal procedures. She led me directly to the central laboratory complex where 23 scientists and technical specialists had been working for 8 months to preserve the genetic heritage of human agriculture while developing new crop varieties that could survive in post-collapse conditions. The laboratory facilities were beyond anything I had imagined possible on a floating platform. Climate-controlled storage units maintained genetic samples at optimal temperature and humidity conditions using power systems that operated independently of the main facility grid. Genetic analysis equipment that could identify useful traits in plant samples and transfer those traits to other varieties using techniques that didn't require the massive infrastructure of traditional agricultural research. Experimental growing facilities where scientists could test new crop varieties under controlled conditions that simulated different climate scenarios.
They had succeeded beyond what I thought was possible under emergency conditions. The storage systems contained viable seeds from 847 different crop varieties, heritage tomatoes that could grow in degraded soil, ancient grains that required minimal water, drought-resistant legumes that could fix nitrogen in soil that had been depleted by intensive agriculture, salt-tolerant rice varieties that could produce food in coastal areas where rising sea levels had contaminated freshwater irrigation systems. They had preserved genetic samples from traditional farming communities whose agricultural knowledge had been passed down through generations, from experimental research programs that had been developing climate-adapted crops before the collapse, from wild plant populations that might contain genetic traits useful for developing entirely new agricultural systems. But more importantly, they had continued active research despite the collapse of global scientific infrastructure. Dr. Martinez had developed soil treatment techniques that could restore agricultural productivity in land that had been damaged by drought, erosion, and chemical contamination. Dr. Chen had created climate modeling systems that could help farmers plan crop rotations adapted to weather patterns that changed faster than traditional growing seasons. Dr. Williams had established seed production protocols that could allow communities to maintain genetic diversity and continue crop improvement even without access to specialized laboratory equipment. The genetic resources they had preserved weren't just seeds. They were the foundation for rebuilding agricultural systems that could feed humanity in a world where traditional farming had become impossible. But they were also dying. Dr. Okafor led me through Alpha 7's damaged sections, explaining the cascade of system failures that had brought the facility to the edge of collapse despite its scientific achievements. The platform's desalination system had been damaged 2 months ago during the storm that generated wave heights exceeding the facility's design specifications. Salt water had flooded electrical systems, corroded metal components, and contaminated the freshwater storage tanks that supplied both human consumption and laboratory operations. They had been rationing fresh water so severely that several team members were showing signs of kidney failure and chronic dehydration. The scientific staff was consuming less than 1 liter of water per day, enough to prevent immediate death, but insufficient to maintain health and cognitive function during intensive research activities. Dr. Chin had been recycling laboratory water through improvised filtration systems, using equipment designed for plant research to purify water for human consumption. Dr. Williams had been monitoring everyone's hydration status using medical equipment, making daily decisions about whether individual team members were healthy enough to continue research activities. The power grid was failing as solar panels degraded without maintenance and battery storage systems reached the end of their operational life. The facility's electrical systems can maintain either the genetic storage units that preserved seed samples or the life support systems that kept the research team alive, but not book simultaneously. Every day, they faced the choice between preserving the genetic resources that could feed humanity's future and maintaining the immediate conditions necessary for their own survival. They had chosen to preserve the seeds. The genetic storage units operated continuously, maintaining optimal temperature and humidity conditions for the crop varieties that represented humanity's best hope for agricultural recovery. The living quarters were heated only during the coldest hours of the night. The laboratory spaces operated with minimal lighting. The communication systems broadcast automated distress signals, but human operators had been transferred to other duties to conserve power for essential research activities. Dr. Okafor explained the research programs they had managed to continue despite a deteriorating conditions. They had successfully developed new strains of wheat that could grow in soil with salt contamination levels that would kill traditional varieties. They had created corn varieties that could produce adequate nutrition with 40% less water than conventional crops. They had preserved genetics from traditional farming communities in regions where indigenous knowledge about drought-resistant crops had been maintained through generations of subsistence agriculture. Most importantly, they had established protocols for transferring this knowledge to communities that needed it immediately. Simplified growing techniques that could be implemented without specialized equipment, seed preparation methods that could be taught to farmers with basic literacy skills, soil treatment procedures that use materials available in most coastal communities, plant breeding techniques that could allow communities to adapt crop varieties to local conditions over multiple growing seasons.
But the knowledge was useless if it remained isolated on a failing research platform. The genetic resources were meaningless if they couldn't be distributed to communities that could use them to establish new agricultural systems. The research data was worthless if it couldn't be shared with other scientists and agricultural specialists who are working on similar problems in isolation. Dr. Okafor asked me a question that I still think about every day. Captain, if you could save either the people who created this knowledge or the knowledge itself, which would you choose? We can evacuate the research team to your ship, continue our work using your facilities as a mobile laboratory, but that would consume your food supplies faster than you can afford. Or we can transfer the genetic resources and research data to your ship, ensuring that the knowledge survives, but the people who understand it best would remain here until the platform fails completely. The calculation was brutal in its simplicity. 23 additional people aboard the Esperanza Mondiale would consume our remaining food supplies 40% faster, reducing our operational capability from 64 days to 38 days. The difference could determine whether we reached a functioning port where we could resupply or died at sea with the most important genetic cargo in human history. Saving the researchers would mean risking the loss of the genetic resources they had preserved. Saving the genetic resources would mean sacrificing the people who understood them best. But the calculation wasn't actually that simple. Dr. Okafor's team included specialists whose knowledge couldn't be replaced. Dr. Martinez understood soil chemistry and plant nutrition at a level that would require years to replicate through normal training. Dr. Chen had developed climate adaptation models that incorporated factors that traditional agricultural science had never needed to consider. Dr. Williams had worked with indigenous farming communities and understood traditional techniques that weren't documented in any scientific literature. The genetic resources were irreplaceable, but so was the human knowledge needed to use them effectively. Seeds were worthless without understanding of growing conditions, soil requirements, water needs, and processing techniques. Genetic samples could preserve biological diversity, but human expertise was required to adapt that diversity to specific local conditions and changing environmental circumstances. Dr. Okafor made the decision for all of us. She would remain on Alpha 7 with 8 of her senior research staff, maintaining the platform's systems as long as possible while transferring genetic resources and training materials to the Esperanza Mondiale. 15 of the younger team members, including the specialist with the most detailed knowledge of practical application techniques, would evacuate to our ship. They would carry forward both the genetic resources and the expertise needed to use them effectively. The senior researchers would stay behind, not just to maintain platform operations, but to continue working on research problems that required the laboratory equipment that couldn't be transferred to our ship. They would document their ongoing research, prepare detailed technical manuals, and maintain communication with the evacuation team as long as their systems remained operational. They would become the lighthouse keepers of agricultural science, maintaining their post until the platform could no longer sustain human life.
The decision was presented as a logical allocation of resources, but everyone understood its real implications. The senior researchers were choosing to die so that their knowledge could survive. They were sacrificing their lives to ensure that genetic resources and scientific expertise reached communities that could use them to rebuild agricultural systems. They were making the ultimate humanitarian choice, giving their lives to save the lives of people they would never meet, in places they would never see, facing challenges they could only imagine. We spent 2 days transferring genetic samples, research equipment, and documentation from Alpha 7 to the Esperanza Mondiale. The evacuation was more complex than moving people and cargo. We were transferring an entire scientific research program with all its accumulated knowledge, specialized equipment, and ongoing experimental protocols. Container 412 Gamma was converted into a mobile genetic storage facility, with climate control systems rigged from Alpha 7's backup equipment. Container 385 Delta became a mobile laboratory equipped with basic analysis tools and seed preparation equipment that could support continued research during our voyage. Dr. Martinez supervised the transfer of soil analysis equipment that could help communities assess local growing conditions and adapt crop varieties accordingly. Dr. Chen documented climate adaptation protocols in technical manuals that could be understood by agricultural extension workers with basic scientific training. Dr. Williams prepared seed packets with detailed growing instructions for each variety, including information about soil requirements, water needs, planting schedules, and harvesting techniques adapted to different climate conditions. The 15 researchers who evacuated to the Esperanza Mondiale weren't just passengers seeking rescue. They were the faculty of a floating university, the technical staff of a mobile agricultural extension service, the specialists who could teach communities how to implement the agricultural innovations that Alpha 7 had developed. Their evacuation transformed our mission from emergency food distribution to long-term agricultural reconstruction. But we were still operating under severe resource constraints. Our food supplies had been recalculated based on 42 people instead of 27. Our fuel consumption had increased due to the additional weight of genetic storage equipment and laboratory facilities. Our operational timeline had compressed from 64 days to 38 days. We were carrying the tools for humanity's agricultural recovery, but we were racing against time to deliver them before our own systems failed. On the morning of departure,
I stood on Alpha 7's observation deck with Dr. Rocaffer, watching the sun rise over an ocean that seemed emptier and more hostile than when we'd arrived. She handed me a sealed drive containing every piece of agricultural research her team had completed. 8 months of work that could determine whether humanity learned to feed itself again or gradually starved despite having the knowledge to prevent it. She told me about her daughter, who had been studying agricultural engineering at UC Davis when the Cascade failure began, about her decision to join the Alpha 7 program instead of searching for her family when communication systems collapsed, about her husband, who had been managing seed distribution programs for the Malian government when locust swarms destroyed the final harvest and the regional administration evacuated to refugee camps in neighboring countries, about her choice to work on solutions for humanity's future rather than protecting her personal relationships in the present. "Captain," she said, "if my daughter survived, if any children survive this collapse, they'll need these seeds and this knowledge to feed themselves and their own children. Someone has to choose the future, even when it costs everything we care about in the present. Someone has to preserve the tools for recovery, even when we can't live to see that recovery happen." We departed Alpha 7 at 0800 hours, leaving behind 8 researchers who had chosen to maintain their scientific post until the platform could no longer sustain human life. I watched through binoculars as the facility grew smaller on the horizon, still broadcasting its automated distress signals, still maintaining genetic storage systems that preserved humanity's agricultural heritage, still operating as a beacon of scientific knowledge in an ocean that had forgotten the value of long-term thinking. 15 researchers now lived aboard the Esperanza Mondiale, along with genetic resources from 847 crop varieties and research equipment that could support agricultural recovery operations across multiple continents. Our mission had evolved from emergency humanitarian relief to long-term reconstruction support. We were no longer just distributing food to prevent immediate starvation. We were distributing the knowledge and resources that communities needed to feed themselves permanently. But we were still starving. Slowly, carefully managed, but starving nonetheless. The integration of Alpha 7's research team transformed the Esperanza Mondiale in ways that went beyond just adding 15 people to our crew manifest. Dr. Elena Martinez, the senior soil scientist who had evacuated with the genetic resources, established a mobile laboratory in container 445 Delta using equipment that had been salvaged from the platform. Within days, she was analyzing soil samples we collected at every port, determining which locations had the chemistry and nutrient profiles necessary to support the drought-resistant crop varieties we now carried. Her analysis revealed patterns that traditional agricultural science had never needed to consider. Coastal communities where rising sea levels had contaminated freshwater aquifers could still support agriculture using salt-tolerant rice varieties that Alpha 7 had developed from genetics, preserved from traditional farming communities in Bangladesh and Vietnam. Inland regions where drought had depleted topsoil could be restored using nitrogen-fixing legumes that required minimal water but could rebuild soil chemistry over multiple growing seasons. Navigation Officer Petrov worked with Dr. James Chen, Alpha 7's climate specialist, to plot new courses based not on emergency calls for food aid, but on agricultural potential and recovery possibilities. They identified coastal regions where rainfall patterns, soil composition, and political stability might allow for experimental farming operations using the genetic resources we carried. Our route became a search for hope instead of a response to desperation, a systematic survey of locations where new agricultural systems might be established rather than random distribution of emergency supplies to whoever called for help. Dr. Williams, the plant breeding specialist who had worked with indigenous farming communities before joining Alpha 7, taught practical skills to our crew that transformed their understanding of food production. Chief Engineer Santos learned to maintain seed storage climate systems with precision that exceeded the original equipment specifications, adjusting temperature and humidity controls to optimize storage conditions for specific varieties of genetic material. Communications Officer Chen learned to broadcast agricultural information instead of just emergency signals, transmitting growing instructions and soil preparation techniques to communities that were monitoring humanitarian frequencies. Medical Officer Kim learned to identify nutritional deficiencies that could be addressed by specific crop varieties rather than just medical supplements, understanding how traditional crops could provide micronutrients and vitamins that weren't available in emergency food distributions. She worked with Dr. Martinez to develop nutrition education programs that could be implemented alongside seed distribution, teaching communities how to combine different crops to achieve balanced diets, even when traditional food sources were unavailable.
The research team didn't just bring genetic resources and scientific equipment. They brought a different perspective on what our mission could accomplish. Instead of managing decline and distributing scarce resources until they ran out, we could support recovery and distribute the tools that communities needed to feed themselves permanently. Instead of racing against starvation, we could work toward agricultural reconstruction that would eliminate starvation as a long-term threat. 3 weeks after leaving Alpha 7, we intercepted a radio signal that validated everything we had risked to preserve the genetic resources. Not a distress call, but a success report from the Azores. A Portuguese agricultural cooperative had successfully grown Alpha 7's drought-resistant wheat using traditional farming methods combined with new soil treatment techniques that Dr. Martinez had developed. They had achieved yields 30% higher than pre-collapse agricultural production in the same region. They weren't just surviving on subsistence agriculture, they were producing surplus food. For the first time in 137 days, we received a message from someone who was asking for seeds instead of food. The message was broadcast on amateur radio frequencies by Dr. Maria Santos, coordinator of the Azores Agricultural Recovery Project. Her transmission was detailed, technical, and focused on expanding agricultural production rather than managing emergency nutrition needs. This is Dr. Santos calling any vessels with agricultural technical support. We have successfully established drought-resistant wheat production using experimental varieties. Current yields are exceeding projections. We are requesting access to additional genetic varieties for expanded trials, technical consultation on soil improvement techniques, and coordination with other communities implementing similar programs. Her broadcast included data on soil conditions, climate measurements, water availability, and population sizes that could be supported by expanded agricultural production. But more importantly, it included evidence that communities were moving beyond survival towards sustainable food production. The Azores weren't just growing enough food to prevent starvation, they were developing agricultural systems that could support population growth and economic development. The approach to the Azores felt different from every other port we had visited during our 137-day mission. Instead of abandoned docks and empty harbors, we saw active fishing boats using fuel-efficient techniques to harvest marine resources sustainably. Instead of desperate crowds seeking emergency food aid, we saw people working on infrastructure repair projects, maintaining equipment, and implementing long-term development plans. The Portuguese government had somehow maintained administrative continuity through the global collapse, continuing to pay agricultural subsidies to local farmers, maintaining research partnerships with universities that were still operational, and supporting cooperative organizations that were implementing innovative farming techniques. They had managed the transition from global industrial agriculture to local sustainable production without experiencing the social collapse that had devastated most regions.
Dr. Maria Santos met us at the dock with the reception committee that included soil scientists, seed production specialists, agricultural extension workers, and farmers who were implementing experimental growing techniques. Not refugees seeking emergency assistance, not officials desperate for food aid, but professionals who were ready to expand agricultural production using scientific methods and genetic resources that could support permanent food security. They didn't need our emergency food supplies. They had maintained potato cultivation using geothermal growing systems that took advantage of volcanic soil conditions unique to the islands. They had established fish farming operations using updated aquaculture techniques that produced more protein per unit of resources than traditional fishing. They had maintained livestock populations using reduced herd sizes but improved nutrition protocols that optimized animal health and reproductive success. What they needed was exactly what we carried: genetic resources that could diversify their crop production, research data that could optimize their growing techniques, and scientific expertise that could help them adapt agricultural systems to climate conditions that continued to change unpredictably. They needed the tools to move from successful local production to regional agricultural leadership that could support recovery efforts across multiple communities.
But the most important development was the establishment of communication networks that could coordinate agricultural recovery efforts across the Atlantic basin. The Azores agreed to serve as a relay station for technical information, broadcasting agricultural data and research updates to communities that were monitoring humanitarian frequencies. They would coordinate seed distribution to communities that needed specific genetic varieties. They would provide technical consultation to agricultural projects that were implementing similar recovery strategies. When we departed the Azores, we carried letters and technical documentation from communities throughout the region that were working on agricultural recovery. Requests for specific genetic varieties from farming cooperatives in Cape Verde. Technical questions about soil restoration from communities in Morocco that were trying to restore farmland damaged by drought. Reports of successful experimental agriculture from coastal towns in Senegal that were developing salt-tolerant crops for production in areas affected by sea level rise. We had become more than a food distribution vessel. We were a floating agricultural extension service, a mobile research station, a communication hub connecting communities that were working toward agricultural recovery rather than just managing survival. Our cargo had evolved from emergency rations to permanent solutions, from calories that would be consumed immediately to genetic resources that could feed people for generations.
Day 159. We're still at sea, but everything has changed. Container 847 Alpha still holds genetic samples that could restart agriculture across 3 continents. But now, those samples are being actively distributed to communities that have the knowledge and resources to use them effectively. Container 623 Bravo contains research data that could improve crop yields in marginal growing conditions. But now that data is being shared through communication networks that connect agricultural recovery projects across multiple regions. Container 199 Charlie holds training materials and technical documentation, but now those materials are being used to establish educational programs that can teach sustainable farming techniques to the next generation. Dr. Martinez has established partnerships with agricultural research stations in 12 countries. Communities that maintained some institutional continuity through the collapse are implementing experimental growing programs using genetic resources from Alpha 7. University programs that survived the economic breakdown are conducting research on crop adaptation and soil restoration.
Government agricultural services that retained technical expertise are coordinating seed distribution and providing extension support to local farming operations. Dr. Chen has developed climate adaptation protocols that help farmers adjust to weather patterns that change faster than traditional crop cycles. His work is being broadcast to communities throughout the Atlantic Basin, providing technical information that can prevent crop failures and optimize resource utilization. Dr. Williams has established seed production networks that maintain genetic diversity while adapting crop varieties to local conditions, ensuring that communities can continue agricultural improvement even without access to specialized laboratory equipment. We've learned to stretch more than just food supplies. We stretch knowledge, stretch hope, stretch the possibility that human civilization can recover from its own mistakes. Every seed variety we distribute multiplies across growing seasons, creating genetic diversity that supports resilient agricultural systems. Every farming technique we teach spreads through community networks, adapted to local conditions and shared with neighboring regions. Every successful harvest becomes a model for 10 more experimental plots, demonstrating that agricultural recovery is possible even in areas where traditional farming has failed. Our fuel supplies remain critical. Our food reserves continue to diminish as we support 42 people instead of the original 27. But our cargo has transformed from emergency rations that would be consumed and depleted to permanent solutions that multiply and expand. We're not just feeding people anymore. We're teaching them to feed themselves, providing them with the genetic resources and technical knowledge they need to establish sustainable food production systems.
The emergency frequencies still crackle with distress calls, but the nature of those calls has changed significantly. Instead of desperate requests for immediate food aid, we hear reports of successful harvests from communities that are implementing agricultural recovery programs. Instead of pleas for emergency supplies, we receive technical questions about soil preparation and crop rotation from farmers who are adapting new varieties to local growing conditions. Instead of calls for rescue, we monitor communication networks that coordinate seed distribution and share agricultural information between communities that are working toward food security. Last week, we received a message that exemplified the transformation our mission has undergone. A farming cooperative in Ghana reported that Alpha 7's drought-resistant millet had not only survived a 6-month dry season, but had produced enough surplus grain to establish a community seed bank that could support agricultural development in neighboring villages. They weren't just producing enough food to prevent starvation in their own community. They were developing the capacity to share genetic resources and technical knowledge with other regions facing similar agricultural challenges. The report included detailed information about growing techniques, soil preparation methods, and seed processing procedures that could be adapted by communities with similar climate conditions but different soil types and water availability. They had modified Alpha 7's research protocols to work with locally available materials and community-based labor rather than specialized equipment and technical expertise. They had created a model for agricultural recovery that could be replicated and adapted by communities throughout West Africa. I've learned that hunger isn't just about calories, it's about hope. People can survive on minimal nutrition if they believe their situation will improve through their own efforts. They can work through exhaustion and resource scarcity if they're building something permanent that will benefit their children and their communities. They can sacrifice immediate comfort if they're contributing to recovery efforts that could restore prosperity and food security over time. The Esperanza Mondiale broadcasts continuously now, but we're no longer transmitting emergency signals. We broadcast educational programming, agricultural techniques adapted to post-collapse conditions, climate adaptation strategies that help communities plan long-term food production, genetic preservation protocols that ensure crop diversity survives even if individual communities face setbacks. We become a floating radio station for the future,
sharing knowledge and hope with anyone willing to listen and learn. Tomorrow, we'll reach the Canary Islands again. They've requested consultation on expanding their greenhouse operations using Alpha 7's hydroponic systems and technical expertise from our research team. They want to become a regional center for seed production and agricultural education, a permanent research station that could support recovery operations across the Eastern Atlantic and coordinate with similar facilities in other regions.
We'll transfer our remaining genetic samples to their climate-controlled facilities, ensuring that the resources Alpha 7 preserved will be maintained and distributed through networks that can reach communities throughout the region. We'll train their technical staff in genetic preservation protocols and seed production techniques. We'll establish communication systems that can coordinate agricultural recovery efforts across multiple continents. And then we'll continue sailing. Because the work isn't finished. Because there are still communities that need genetic resources. Still farmers who need training in climate-adapted agriculture. Still regions where agricultural recovery is possible, but hasn't begun because they lack access to the tools and knowledge that could make it successful. The Esperanza Mondiale has become something that was never planned in any humanitarian operations manual. We're not just a food distribution vessel anymore. We're not just an emergency response ship. We've evolved into a floating catalyst for agricultural recovery, a mobile platform that connects isolated communities working on similar problems, a bridge between the scientific knowledge preserved by institutions like Alpha 7 and the practical implementation needs of communities that are trying to feed themselves in a world where traditional agriculture has failed. Our mission has expanded beyond the Atlantic Basin. We've received communication from agricultural recovery projects in the Mediterranean, communities in coastal Africa that are implementing successful farming programs, research stations in South America that are developing new techniques for tropical agriculture in changing climate conditions. The network of recovery efforts is larger than any of us had realized, but it lacks coordination, lacks access to genetic resources, lacks the scientific knowledge that could accelerate progress and prevent costly failures. Dr. Martinez has developed training programs that can be implemented by communities with basic literacy and minimal technical resources, soil restoration techniques using locally available organic materials, seed-saving methods that preserve genetic diversity without requiring specialized storage equipment, crop rotation strategies that optimize nutrition and soil health while adapting to unpredictable weather patterns. Dr. Chin has created climate monitoring protocols that communities can implement using simple equipment and observations, weather prediction methods that don't depend on satellite data or computer modeling, seasonal planning techniques that help farmers adapt to changing climate patterns while maintaining productive agriculture.
Dr. Williams has established seed distribution networks that ensure genetic diversity reaches communities that need specific varieties for their particular soil and climate conditions. She maintains communication with farming cooperatives, university programs, and research stations that are preserving and developing crop varieties adapted to post-collapse conditions.
The 15 researchers from Alpha 7 have become the faculty of a floating university, teaching agricultural recovery to students they meet in every port. But they're also learning from those students, adapting scientific knowledge to local conditions, incorporating traditional farming techniques that have proven effective in changing environments, developing new approaches that combine modern genetics with indigenous agricultural wisdom. Communication Officer Chen has established a broadcasting schedule that reaches communities across multiple time zones and language groups. Morning transmissions focus on technical information, soil preparation techniques, seed treatment methods, climate adaptation strategies. Evening broadcasts share success stories and coordinate resource sharing between communities that are working on similar challenges. Night frequencies carry research data and genetic information for technical specialists who are implementing advanced agricultural programs. The emergency frequencies that once carried only distress calls now host a community of agricultural practitioners who share information, coordinate resource distribution, and support each other's recovery efforts.
Farmers in Ghana share insights with agricultural cooperatives in Morocco. Research stations in the Canary Islands coordinate with university programs in Cape Verde. Fishing communities in Senegal exchange techniques with coastal villages in Guinea-Bissau. We've learned that recovery isn't just about preserving the past or returning to previous conditions. Recovery is about adaptation, innovation, and building systems that are more resilient than what existed before the collapse. The agricultural systems that are emerging from these recovery efforts aren't just restored versions of pre-collapse farming. They're new approaches that combine genetic diversity with sustainable techniques, that integrate traditional knowledge with modern science, that prioritize local resilience over global efficiency. The communities that are succeeding aren't trying to rebuild the industrial agriculture that failed. They're developing diversified farming systems that can adapt to changing conditions, that produce nutrition rather than just calories, that maintain soil health over generations rather than maximizing short-term yields. They're creating food security through resilience rather than through scale. My name is Captain Elena Vasquez. I command what was once the last supply ship, but we're not in the supply business anymore. We're in the recovery business. We carry hope instead of just calories, solutions instead of just emergency aid, knowledge instead of just resources. We've learned that the end of one world can be the beginning of another, that collapse can create space for innovation, that communities can build something better from the remnants of what failed. The ocean is vast, but not empty. There are communities out there growing food in ways that were impossible before the collapse, developing agricultural systems that are more sustainable and resilient than anything that existed during the age of industrial farming. There are researchers preserving genetic diversity and developing new techniques for climate adaptation. There are farmers teaching their children skills that will be essential for survival and prosperity in a world that demands different solutions than the past.
If you're listening, if you're working on agricultural recovery, if you're trying to feed your community or preserve seeds or adapt farming techniques to new conditions, you're not alone. There's a network of communities, researchers, and practitioners who are working on the same challenges. There's genetic diversity preserved and available for communities that need specific crop varieties. There's technical knowledge being shared and adapted to local conditions. Plant seeds, share knowledge, teach skills, build networks, support recovery, stay growing. We are still sowing the future.